Treasure to everybody. Greetings to everybody. So how many years have we been holding this? So what benefit do you see from this kind of debate where you learn about subjective mind and objects, the relationship, and giving the definitions of these things, and the logical extension perversions between the reason and the predicate and so forth? So what benefit do you find from this? So does it help you to understand the other subjects that you study, thinking about, I mean, if this is so, this must be the case, and finding things rather logical? So the purpose of studying logic is whatever you have learned from the dialectical debate should be used as a tool for examining things. In our texts, traditional texts on Buddhist philosophy and logic, and also giving the debate procedures. So after having studied these things, you should be able to take the same logic and use it for other subjects, such as modern subjects, which we did not have in the past in Tibetan language. So these debates, dialectical debates, should help us to examine things that we study in schools regarding the modern subjects. So I've been, for the last 30 years, holding discussions with scientists, and then and also we have monks from big monastic institutions there who are studying science. So these the monks who are studying science from the Western scientists, and many of these teachers who come from the West, say that, of course, these monks do not know mathematics and other subjects, but when the teachers explain the different subjects to these monks, then they are able to have a better understanding, deeper understanding of the subjects that they learn from the scientists. And so it's something different from they find from other Western students. So why that is so, why this difference is because these monks have studied the logical procedure which they use in their study of philosophy and logic, and finding a relationship between things. If something is X, and then it should be Y, and so forth. So because of this kind of dialectical debate that they study, so similarly, in what you study regarding the different modern subjects, it's important to not just leave your studies at the hearing or listening, hearing level, but then you have to reflect on the subjects, and for that, examination and using logic is very important, very useful. So personally, as I have already said before, I have been holding discussions with scientists, and when the scientists make their presentations, they explain their own fields of research and introduce me those subjects. So of course they are talking from their own conviction about whatever they are explaining to me, and then later on when I ask questions, and I tell them that you said such and such thing, and then if this is the case, then it should be so and so, and then they tell me that they have to really think more again about this. Of course, I have not studied science and mathematics, but then the investigation that we do through debate and dialectical debate and logic and it has given me this tool to learn things more profoundly. So this is very profound. And then after studying, having studied logic and debate, and then you develop what are known as clear, vivid, extensive, quick wisdom, and so forth. And then there are those of the understandings or knowledge drawn from hearing, reflection, and meditation. So this, you have to be able to develop these things through studying your different subjects. So the first understanding drawn from hearing is what you hear from your teachers in this class. And then whatever the teachers have teach you, you come to know this is so and so. So that is the level of hearing, the understanding drawn from hearing. And then having heard these different subjects from the teachers, then you reflect on the different points and use investigative mind, inquisitive mind, and so you do inquiry and then gain some conviction. Oh, this must be. If this is the case, then it must be so and so, and so in this way you develop conviction. And then having gained some conviction, then when you come to the decisive conclusion that it must be such and such, something that must be so and so, so you gain full you determine fully that this must be the case, and to such an extent that when you develop such an understanding, then you will not be when somebody argues against you about that point, you'll be able to hold your position firmly. So the understanding drawn from hearing is not so stable. It's just knowing what the subjects, the teachers have to teach you. But then if you give thought to them over and over again and gain conviction in them, and then you know that different reasons to come to a certain conclusion, and you'll be also able to inquire what kind of reasons there must be for other points as well. And so therefore you develop the second level of understanding, which is understanding drawn from reflection. So, of course, regarding history, for example, you don't have much to do about reflection or against attitude as such through reflection and so forth, but you just study what is the fact about something that has happened in the world. But then other subjects, you can do investigation and gain conviction in them, and then develop, so determine that such and such things are so and so forth, and then whatever you study also becomes part of your life. So the different subjects you study, first you develop regarding them. First you develop the understanding through listening, and then you draw conviction through reflection, thinking that it must be such and so and so. And then, having developed that kind of conviction, then you develop you can use it to change your attitude, your outlook on something. And so that may be the level of the understanding drawn through meditation. So when that happens, then your outlook on things would be different, rather naturally. So these three levels of understanding or knowledge or wisdom are very important. So if you just suffice with what you study hear from the teachers, because if somebody argues against you, asks you questions, then you will not be able to answer properly. But if you give thought to them, reflect on what you study, then it will be you'll be able to learn better whatever you are studying. So if you do not find any conviction, certitude in whatever you study, but just find just content with whatever you hear from the teachers, to pass your examination, that will not be so effective. And so this kind of dialectical debate, in doing investigation through dialectical debate, is very, very important. So in the beginning, initially, when we started the Tibetan schools in Shimla and Mussoorie and so forth, we had the dialectical debates as part of the curriculum. But then this kind of declined over the years. So now, these days, you have been reinstituting this curriculum in the schools, and so the staff members and teachers have taken responsibility to teach you, and then the students yourselves have taken interest in studying debate. And so I would like to congratulate you. So, of course, at this point, you have studied from your teacher, and maybe you do not have any kind of conviction in the whatever you have studied. But then, in the future, you should be able to use this kind of logic in your life. And so, this is the 5th year that we are having this Dharma discourse. So it seems each year there are more and more people taking interest. So regarding Buddhism, so as humans, we have feelings of pain and pleasure. On the basis of that, then we have the wish to have happiness and not to suffer. So this is not only the humans, but all sentient beings, including animals, birds, and so forth. Everyone has this wish to overcome suffering and wishing for happiness. So this is something natural to all sentient beings. But with regard to humans, so we have greater intelligence compared to other animals. So the part of the brain which is, has to do with intelligence is greater, bigger in humans. The intelligence has nothing to do with the size of the body as such. So human beings have a very powerful intelligence. So that alone doesn't guarantee us happiness and overcoming suffering. The animals, of course, are very effective in finding food, and when there's no danger, they rather stay relaxed. But for humans, because of our thought processes, lots of thought processes going on in our mind, so we have this acute sense of thinking, different superstitions and conceptions, and then we can also think about the future, planning about the future, and so, which we are able to do because of this human intelligence. We can see some people very intelligent, very bright. They can learn the different subjects rather very easily, but then they are all overcome with worries. Of course, they don't lack the daily needs, but then because of certain set of mindsets, they are rather preoccupied with worry. So this intelligence alone doesn't guarantee us happiness. So of course, because of this intelligence, we can think a lot about future and so forth. We can think about different things, and because of that, we are able to make developments and progress. So if we lacked this intelligence, then we would, in this world, we wouldn't have all these material developments as well. And so this is necessary for our survival as well. So we have this very bright mind, and on top of that, so what we have to do is use this for experiencing happiness, and not to become a cause for our own suffering. So today the world has really materially advanced so much, but that doesn't also guarantee us happiness. Therefore, today scientists there is this awareness that the material development alone is not enough. So for the last 3,000 to 4,000 years, so when humans in the beginning faced difficulties and problems, people have prayed to certain higher power to overcome these difficulties. So people have rather thought that they put their hope in a certain religious figure and gods and so forth, because they found themselves rather powerless over the nature. And then in the last 200 or 300 years, people didn't leave just things at the level of appearance, and but have started investigating the reality of things. So, for example, the inanimate objects around us, people have checked what they are made of, and then they found that they are made up of smaller particles, so atoms and subatomic particles and so forth. And so things have not been left just at the level of appearance. And having found that about the reality of how things actually exist, then they have thought about how to use them for making change in the world. And therefore, there's been this science, development in science and technology, through which these developments in science and technology have been able to overcome our sickness, diseases, and so forth, which people in the past have just relied on for the cure, just relied on certain prayers. So through science and technology, we humans have been able to make material developments and progress. And so through what people have been praying for thousands of years are now immediately produced through science and technology, and therefore people's attention have been rather directed towards material development. And therefore, in the 19th and 20th centuries, people have focused mostly, primarily on material development. But then, towards the end of the 20th century, on the one hand, in the affluent societies, from people in these affluent societies, materially developed societies, have found that although they have all the amenities, still they are not happy. They do not have peace of mind, and they have become aware that this peace of mind cannot be produced through some material development. And also of course, people rely on some antidepressants and so forth to overcome depression, unhappiness, but which give temporary relief. But the material developments alone cannot give you peace of mind and happiness. So people have become aware that our suffering is also rooted in our own thinking and our outlook, attitudes. And therefore, people have also thought about overcoming the suffering in the sense that they get some distraction through their eyes and seeing different sights and sounds, hearing sounds and music and so forth, and try to draw happiness based on these sensory experiences. So the experiences of sights, sounds, smell, taste, and sensation, tactile sensation, are mainly what people use to draw happiness, to overcome unhappy states of mind. And therefore people are more drawn towards the external stimuli to draw some satisfaction and happiness within themselves, such as sports and then wearing very expensive clothes and eating expensive foods and so forth. So basically, what we call as sensual objects are what people try to use to draw happiness, and people seem to consider these as the essence in their life. But then these are not. What they're trying to do is trying to draw happiness not based on the sixth sense, that the mind itself, but just those of the sensory experiences. And therefore people have now found that material development alone doesn't give peace of mind. Of course, in science, modern science, there is no difference between what we call the Tokpa and Tokme, or conceptual mind and non-conceptual mind, and how these these different types of minds operate on their objects. So in science there have not been so much awareness about how our conceptual minds operate on their objects. They only focus on the sensory perceptions. So the sensory experiences are mainly based on the body. But then there are other, compared to this, the experiences based on our mind. The sixth mind is much more powerful. For example, if you have some physical sickness, then in your mind, for example, in the case of a practitioner, then they can think about their sickness or disease being the product or result of their karma, and therefore they can think about being able to experience the result of whatever karma they have collected in the past, created in the past, and they find some satisfaction from that. But then in the world, there are people who endure physical hardships, thinking of making money and fame and so forth, and they do not mind going through these physical hardships in order to have satisfaction in their mind. So they voluntarily, or they're willing to undergo those hardships. Secondly, based on our mind, people find that whatever they do is rather satisfaction. They find satisfaction in them. So we can see that the experiences based on our own mind rather than the sensory perceptions are much more powerful. So with regard to the sensory perceptions, of course, they do not have much to do with the mental experience as such. And therefore people are drawn towards those. Today what we see is people are drawn towards material developments. And even in schools, when students are not able to think about how our sixth mind has so much influence on our life, and they are not able to deal with those experiences, then there is lots of dissatisfaction, and then in the worst case scenario, what people do is use guns and weapons to kill others in schools. And so people also even go to the length of committing suicides in all kinds of range of age. So material development alone does not guarantee us happiness. So we know this. On the other hand, and even within science itself, there is the science of the neurobiology, dealing with the brain cells and so forth. Who finds the certain influence of our thinking, which may consist of conceptual thoughts and so forth, which has influence on our brain. And in medical science, people find that if someone is rather calm and peaceful, then it also helps in preventing sick diseases. And even if someone is sick, then calm mind helps to recover from that sick disease rather more quickly. Whereas if people are overcome with anxiety and fear and all the time, then they see that it really harms our health as well. And therefore, even in science now, people are taking interest in the emotions. So in the past, when the brain scientists talk about the consciousness or mind, they only think about the brain only. But now, people are becoming aware that because of our own thinking, this makes changes in our brain. So what brings change in the brain cells? Which is not the brain itself, then they find this this is something new in science. So now people are becoming aware that the material development alone is not enough to overcome our suffering. So there is a change in people's outlook. And therefore, towards the end of the 20th century, we are now in the 21st century, even amongst the scientists, there are more and more scientists taking interest and paying attention to our emotions and our mind. They are not just doing this out of curiosity, but they don't leave it just as a subject of curiosity, but then even in universities, people are doing research and experiment on how our thinking affects our brain. So there are I know a few universities who are doing serious research on mind. And this also has led people to pay attention to the spiritual traditions as well. When people are more indulged in or focusing on the material development alone, they do not think about or pay attention to the mind. So I know many rich people and many intellectuals who have grown some interest in spiritual tradition. So human needs are not served only by material development. And therefore people have turned their attention to their spiritual traditions. And some people have found that it is important to make mental development, but then they do not take interest in spiritual or religious traditions. So there are such people. For them, of course, the Indian or ancient Indian tradition of secular ethics, we have this. So secular ethics, secularism here doesn't mean non-religion, being anti-religion. As I have heard in the past, some Tibetans use this in that sense. So here we are using this term secularism in the sense of respecting all different religious traditions as well as non-believers. Advani, the Indian politician, has once told me very clearly that the reason why India has been so successful in its democratic system is because we already had this tradition since ancient times. So there were, of course, in Indian spiritual traditions which respect each other, although they differ in their philosophical views. But he gave the example of Charvakas, which is usually translated as hedonist. But Charvakas, he said, didn't believe in the past and future lives and God, Creator, and Savior, and so forth, but only dealt with this life. Whatever happens, happens only in this life. So they were considered as nihilists. So all the rest of the Indian philosophical traditions, spiritual traditions, objected to that tradition, argued against it. But then the practitioners of that tradition, Charvaka tradition, were referred to as rishis or sages. And the practitioners themselves were respected by the rest of the philosophical and spiritual traditions. So the Charvaka practitioners were not completely condemned as on the level of that person. But although there were these different philosophical views and traditions, but then the proponent of that Charvaka tradition was not disrespected, but in fact they were respected. And therefore Advani said, this is the reason why Indian democracy has been so successful. So when we use the term, we are using it in the sense of respecting all religious traditions, spiritual traditions, as well as non-believers. So just as there was this tradition in the past in relation to Charvakas, so we also have to respect the modern non-believers. So secularism is not about being anti-religion or objecting to religion or anything like that, but respecting all. So respecting all human beings, as we say in our own tradition. So every human being doesn't want suffering, but they want happiness. So in that sense, all of us are equal. So we have to get this big picture and respect all human beings. So there are more and more people who say that we need to pay more attention to to our mind and not just focus on the material developments alone. And so for thousands of years, as I usually say, all the religious traditions which have philosophical background answer three questions. The first question is, what is self or I? And then the second question, whether this self or I has beginning or not. And the third question is whether this self or I has an end or not. So this 1 year when I was in an interfaith religious gathering, one Sufi professor was there. He pointed out, brought these three questions. So I found it very good. And the different religious traditions differ from the point of view of how they answer these questions. So with regard to the first question, what is a self or an I? Except for Buddhism, all the rest of the religious traditions believe in a soul in English, and in Sanskrit this Atma. And in our traditional texts, we refer to this as a permanent, singular, and autonomous self, whereby the belief is that the person does not change, but then the psychophysical aggregates of the person change. And therefore the I, or the soul or Atma, is not dependent on our body and mind. It's independent from these. And therefore, in Buddhism, this, according to Buddhism, the definition or the nature of the soul is being permanent, unchanging, singular, and autonomous. So Buddhism rejects that. So it's quite clear from our own experience that this body that we have now, of course, has come from our parents, but then it was not there right at the birth. We know that our body and mind changes. But then we can talk about my body now and my body at the time of my birth. And we can refer back to our past. So when we say my body, my mind, there is this notion that this I, this person, is actually governing the body and the mind. There is this notion as if the body and mind are rather dependent on this person, the I, and that this person, the person himself or herself, is not dependent on the mind and the body. So, apart from Buddhism, all the rest of the religious traditions believe in such a soul theory. So Buddhism, of course, says that this notion that we have about a permanent and singular autonomous self is because of a certain innate imprint that we have. So what this is there is because of the conception that of an independent only existing ego, ego grasping. And because of this ego grasping, we also generate attachment and anger and so forth. So therefore, Buddhism rejects such an autonomous, singular, and permanent or unchanging soul. And in fact, this kind of intensifies our grasping and attachment and anger and all these negative emotions. So Buddhism says that a person is designated on the basis of our body and mind, the psychophysical aggregates. And so with regard to the first question, there are these two camps within the religious and spiritual traditions. On the one hand, we have those who posit the soul theory, and on the other, in the second camp, we have Buddhism, which rejects such a soul. And then with regard to the second question, whether the soul or the person has a beginning or not, so to this question, those who posit the beginning to the person, there are those of the theistic religions which believe that each and every one of us are created by God. So I knew one Christian practitioner who lived in India and wore sadhu, kind of dressed like a sadhu. So I asked him once why can't Christianity believe in past and future lives? And he said, this cannot be possible, but this very life is created by God. And so his answer, I found his answer to be rather quite profound, because when you think in that way, that you are just created in this life by the Creator, you feel closer to the God. So it helps us to bear our own difficulties if we have this belief strongly. So there is this notion in the theistic religions that regarding which in our text they are termed as Takpa Rangjungki Kyebu, which means a being who is permanent, and self-arisen, permanent being. So because the Creator is not created by anything else, so a creator God is termed like that in our Buddhist texts. So the more you feel closer, the greater you feel closer to such a creator God, it helps in reducing our egocentricity. So you totally submit yourself to the Creator, and when you do that, this egocentricity is reduced, so it helps. In Buddhism, so from the point of view of the Buddhism, when someone is created by God, then from the soul has a beginning in that sense. So as soon as and for example, when you think about yourself, you can think my soul. According from the point of view of theistic religions, you can think that the soul is rather created by God. So in that sense, the soul has a beginning in this life. Of course, I have maybe have explained all these things before, but those of you who have not come here in the last discourses. So within this camp of the theistic religion, we have Judaism, Christianity, and I don't know about Taoism, whether it comes into this category or not. And then in Hinduism, there are those of the Brahmanical traditions where they believe that Brahma is the creator. But on the other hand, they also have a belief in law of causality as well. Of course, ultimately, each and every being is created by God. But then we go through the process of creating karma and experiencing their effects and results as well. And so according to them, these Brahmanical traditions, they of course would posit a beginning to the self or the soul. Although it's not, the beginning has not happened in this life only, but it's happened sometime in the past. So within the Hindu's tradition, there, of course, which has evolved before Buddhism, so within the Hinduism, there is one school of thought which is called Sankhya school, and within the Sankhya, there are those of the theistic and non-theistic schools. So in the second camp, which is those traditions which do not accept create a god, the non-theistic Sankhya school is one of them, and then we have Jainism and then Buddhism. So Buddhism and Jainism do not assert or posit a beginning or create a god, a being which is permanent, eternal, and self-arisen. So if that is the case, then how do things arise? Then the answer is through the law based on laws of causality. Things arise from their causes and conditions. So therefore there is no beginning to a person. Of course, Buddhism doesn't believe in this soul, but then Jainism does believe in a soul. Although they do not assert creation by God, but they still believe in a soul. So the second camp, which do not assert creator God, perhaps they also do not believe in a beginning to a person. So from the point of view of Buddhism, whether you posit a beginning to a person or not has to be understood, whether you posit a beginning to the psychophysical aggregates that are basis for a person, this designation. So mainly, of course, when we think about whether there is a beginning to a person or not, we have to think check whether the mind has a beginning or not so much the body or the physical aggregates. So those who can experience pain and pleasure are the ones with some sentiency or mind. So then when we talk about a sentient being or a person, we have to use use that label in relation to the mind. And therefore, so you have to think of reasons. So the inanimate objects have their own substantial causes. So these flowers that we see in front of us, if you think about them, their substantial cause, of course, they have come from the so we can trace the source in the beginning of this century and then the beginning of the last century, and then you can trace it back to the Big Bang. So since the time of Big Bang, the substantial cause of these flowers were there, we can say. So Big Bang itself, of course, because of some huge energy, it happened. The explosion happened because of interaction within so you have to have a substantial cause, an energy which gave rise to that Big Bang. And therefore, when we talk about the law of causality, the Big Bang cannot be only one, but maybe it's beginningless. There must have been many Big Bangs. Because if the Big Bang that we talk about for this universe now has come from has really happened, then it must have happened due to causes and conditions, and those causes and conditions in turn had their own causes and conditions and so forth. And so it's very difficult to posit that this has happened, things have happened by chance or by creation, because of certain creation. So when you have something which is an effect which is produced by its own, then it must have its own causes and conditions. There must be its substantial cause. And of course there are contributing factors as well to them. And then similarly, with regard to the mind is immaterial, it's mere experience. And therefore, this experience, mere experience, cannot come from something which doesn't have any experience, inanimate things, the matter. And therefore, in Buddhism we say that a person is posited on the basis of psychophysical aggregates, and finally it is based on the mental continuum, the mind stream. And therefore this person has no beginning as such, and whether the person has an end or not. I don't know about the theistic religions. I asked some Christians whether it ends. They do not have a clear answer to whether there is an end to the soul or not. Of course, those who go to heaven may live rather happily, but then what about those who go to hell? And then regarding those of the non-theistic religions, the non-theistic Sankhya school, and Jainism and Buddhism. When it comes to answering this third question, whether there's an end, they talk about some conscious being. And when this conscious being that is within us is able to see that everything around us are manifestations or creation of the primal factor, and then everything, the primal factor kind of dissolves into the manifestations, or manifestations are rather dissolved back into that. And so I'm not very clear about and within Buddhism, of course, we have many different philosophical traditions because of the mental dispositions and nature of different sentient beings. We mainly have the 4 different philosophical schools, Vaibhashika, Sutantika, Chittamatra, and Madhyamaka. So the Vaibhashikas perhaps held the philosophical tradition which are found in the Pali tradition of Buddhism. Maybe with regard to Sutrantika, they may have been influenced by the Sanskrit tradition. As well, we find the Sutrantika philosophy in our text on logic and epistemology. And then the Chittamatra and Madhyamikas, of course, they are Madhyamaka school, Mahayana schools. So, according to the Vaibhashikas, school of one sub-school of Vaibhashika, they say that at the end of when someone having become an arahat, or in other words, when someone has become liberated from samsara, and then when they die after that, the mind stream also ceases to exist for that person. But then the rest of the Buddhist philosophical schools say that the mind as such will not cease to exist, even after having overcome all the defilements, delusions that are within us. And so in Buddhism we say that a person cannot be a permanent, singular, autonomous, but a person is designated on the basis of one's psychophysical aggregates. And therefore there is no end to a person as such. So, of course, all the theistic and non-theistic religions and those who assert soul theory and they reject it and so forth. But when it comes philosophically, there is big difference. But then when it comes to practice, for example, in philosophical fields, in Christianity, they talk about the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, Holy Ghost, or and so philosophically there is big difference amongst all these religious traditions. But then the purpose of all these traditions is that of to develop compassion, to feel compassionate to others. And so even the theistic religions say that because we are created by God, we have to have the God who is infinite love and compassion. Therefore, we have to develop, feel compassionate and love other creatures. Whereas non-theistic, the religions which believe in causality, law of causality, say that those actions that are harmful to oneself and others should be avoided, and the causes which bring about happiness help oneself and others. And therefore, when you engage in certain actions, you have to think about helping others and not harming them. And so, when you talk about helping others or benefiting others, it cannot come without having some compassion and love. So whether you think of helping others or harming others, follow your motivation of whether you are compassionate or not. So our pain and pleasure are results of our actions, which are negative or positive. And when you want to bring happiness to others, help others, you have to have this the motivation of compassion. So whether you believe in theistic religion or non-theistic religions, everyone says that we have to help others. So all these religions have been, for the last thousands of years, have been focusing on this. They're helping others, being compassionate to others. Because of this, all these religions have been very beneficial, very helpful to humanity. So although I'm a Buddhist personally, so I have studied Buddhist philosophical texts and texts on epistemology and logic, such as the one written by Master Shantarakshita. So I have studied, although I can see the shortcomings of those theistic religions themselves, but then I can also see the benefit they have for their followers. So even within Buddhism, we have the same teacher, Buddha, but then because of the mental predispositions of his followers, he has given different teachings to different people. So to some of his followers, he has taught the selflessness of persons, and not that of the selflessness of phenomena. But then even amongst the followers to whom he has taught the selflessness of phenomena, there are those who are not yet, he found, not yet receptive to the most profound, subtle, finest level of the selflessness of persons, phenomena. To them he has taught the Chittamatra view, which believes in the non-duality of subject and object. And then he further went to teach the finest or the most profound level of selflessness of phenomena to those who are receptive to them. And therefore, even the Buddha himself has given these different teachings to his own followers because of the difference in their temperament, the followers' temperaments. And therefore, although we have differences in philosophical field, the different traditions all have the same purpose of, when it comes to practice, to help others. And therefore, although I see the shortcomings of the theistic religions, I still respect them because of their the potential to help so many beings and people. And so it's very important for us to respect all religions. But having said that, if you also say that all religions are same, then that may be too much to say. Perhaps you would be going too far if you say all religions are the same. So even with regard to food, we have different tastes. So although this food may be the same, but then because of our body, some food are not gives us allergy, and some whereas they don't give allergy to others, and so forth. So from this is about the Buddhism on the whole. So for us, with regard to us Tibetans, since the Dharma kings of Tibet, Buddhism was established in since their time. Buddhism is established in our land, Tibet. So those usually say that those Tibetan emperors were rather unbiased in their approach to take Buddhism. Of course, we had the pre-Buddhist indigenous religion. So if the kings were not rather prejudiced, they wouldn't have. Rather, they have been rather. They would not have checked what kind of Buddhism there was in China and Tibet and so forth. So of course they may have found some fascination with the Buddhism, Chinese Buddhism, finding them to be good. But then they also went to the source, the origin of Buddhism, which is India, and therefore, except for a few texts that have been translated into Tibetan from Chinese, most of our the classical Indian Buddhist texts were translated from the Sanskrit India directly. So though it may have been rather easier for the Tibetan kings to take Buddhism from China and translate these texts from Chinese, but then they didn't do that. They in fact took the more difficult path of sending people to India. Of course, the translators and Tibetans who came to India faced lots of difficulties, but despite all those hardships, they endured them and came to India. And from within India, they have found the Nalanda tradition to be the most profound, and therefore invited the master Chandarakshita to Tibet. So he was one of the most excellent scholars of Nalanda tradition. Why I said it is because he himself was the founder of the Savatantrika Yogacara, Savatantrika Madhyamaka philosophical school. So it cannot be done by just any kind of scholar. So he found his own philosophical school. So he was a top scholar of Nalanda, who came to Tibet and established Buddhism in Tibet. Of course, Guru Padmasambhava also helped in establishing Buddhism firmly on Tibetan soil. He took the responsibility to overcome the obstacles for that. And then Chandarakshita took the responsibility of teaching Buddhist philosophy to the Tibetans. And therefore, I find Tibetans were really intelligent. Of course, with regard to our food, the Tibetans took our food from, copied or modeled our food rather, we took from China rather than India, where you find rice and dal. Maybe the kings did not find this. So because the Chinese food is more tastier, therefore the Tibetans took our food from the Chinese and not India. So it seems we copied our meal from the Chinese. We have a Tibetan in Tibetan society. There is this meal which is called Decisive, which has so many different kinds of different vegetables and meat and so forth. And then with regard to our clothing, so Tibet, we took the clothes from Mongolians because Tibet is on a high altitude, and the Chinese rather wore silk clothes, which is not so befitting for Tibetan climate. And therefore, we took the clothes from the Mongolians. So they did not stay, the Tibetan kings did not stay satisfied with whatever that we had in our own country, but they took all these different things from different countries. So they are marvelous. So they are really intelligent people. So in order to be able to use our intelligence to see what is right and what is wrong, what is good and bad, we have to be unbiased. We have to be objective. So whatever they found the best, they took them from these different countries. So later on, the Tibetan descendants of Tibetan kings kind of dispersed. One lived in Tibet, and another one went to Ladakh, and so. So during the times of the ancient Tibetan emperors, there were those of the people who were like defending our borders, and then there were also people who were taking care of the internal affairs. So some of these Tibetan armies who were sent to the borders went from the Penpo region of central Tibet. So I met one university researcher who was doing research on law. So he told me that he did some research on Tibetan law, the legal system. So it was all the same everywhere in Tibet. So perhaps he was referring to what we call the 10 the precepts, religious precepts, and 16 human disciplines. So the whole of Tibet was united under these Tibetan emperors. So we also talk about the entire Tibet being of one entity. A united Tibet. So in the Nalanda Buddhist tradition that we have, it comprises of the Pali tradition, which is today spread in Thailand, Sri Lanka, Burma, and so forth, and particularly the Chandarakshita established a monastic tradition in Tibet. He was himself a bhikshu. And so the monastic tradition that we have is similar to the Theravada tradition. So in the what is in the Theravada tradition and the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, Nalanda tradition, there are commonalities between the two, such as this, what are known as the practice of the 37 factors for enlightenment and so forth. But then apart from these common features, there are certain unique features of the Nalanda tradition which comes from the Sanskrit tradition. So from the time of this Nagarjuna down to great Chandarakshita, they have written all their works in Sanskrit. And we have text on logic and epistemology written by Dharmakirti and Dignaga and Dharmakirti and so forth. So their style of writing is also considered, regarded really highly by modern Sanskrit scholars as well. So some of my Nalanda, these Nalanda masters of whom we have the paintings here are all on the academic level. I say that they are all Nalanda professors. So the Nalanda tradition has this emphasis on academic study as well, which is not there perhaps in the Theravada tradition. So of course, if you read the text of Nagarjuna, you will find a lot of usage of logic and reasoning, whereas nonetheless the Buddhist logic and epistemology as a separate discipline may have been kind of designed by Dignaga and Dharmakirti. And so the text that by Dignaga, I've heard that one of the texts by Dignaga is translated into Chinese. Other than that, there are no other texts of Dignaga that are translated by in Chinese, whereas we have in Tibetan. So amongst all the different Buddhist countries today, it is only in Tibet where we have the complete text of the different subjects translated into our language. So Buddhism that spread from China to other countries include those of Korea, Vietnam, and Japan. So I read one book in which this author has praised Buddhism, whereas when he was talking about Tibetan Buddhism, he makes this comment that Tibetan Buddhism is quite strange. He has said that if Buddha were to come to Tibet today, he would be quite astonished. So of course he was not, he made these comments because of seeing what Tibetans do. So he saw Tibetans rather engaged in all these rituals and playing music and making dharma offerings and so forth. Of course, these have to be, even these rituals of the dharma offering and so forth have to be done, and ideally with a certain degree of concentration on the part of the practitioners. Whereas we do not, so there are rituals of overcoming enemies and so forth. So these basically have to be done with a compassionate motivation. But we have not been able to do that. And there is one ritual where some oil is boiled in cauldron, and then at some points there some alcohol is put into rum or whiskey or something like that is put into that boiling oil, and then it makes a huge bursting sound. And so people have rather focused on making that bursting sound, exploding sound, rather more importance, paid more importance to that, rather than practicing the concentration, developing concentration on that. And so at one point there was one monk who prepared the dharma, and so one monk prepared this this alcohol in an animal stomach, and when it came for the master performing the ritual to throw that into the boiling oil, it actually didn't fall into the oil but went somewhere else, and so it was a disgrace. So we have this Gutor ceremony, and of course they were the monks really performed it well. The ritual dance, sacred dance, also was very well done. So after performing the ritual, the oil is thrown on the ground, and then I have seen Tibetan nomads who are called abohors come to this place, and they just roll their body on in the oil that is thrown on the ground. So we Tibetans have rather neglected the more important things. and forgot the learning institutions who focus on the philosophical study, but most of the monasteries focused on rituals, and that also not done rather properly at a very superficial level. And so without having understanding of emptiness or the experience of bodhicitta and so forth, but people have rather focused more on the external appearance of the ritual dance and having all these masks of deities and so forth. So we have used these rituals only for very superficial purposes of overcoming certain minor obstacles and so forth. So therefore, if the Buddha were to come today to in our communities, then of course he would be rather sad. And then with regard to Tantra, it has been rather used for superficial purposes. So this is a misuse of Tantra. And because of such superficial practices that we have focused on, the real Buddhism, for which we have to use our intelligence to the utmost, we have rather neglected them. So we have rather made mistake in doing this, focusing on the superficial practices. Of course, we have a very true teaching of the Buddha, but on the whole, there has been lots of neglect and our own shortcomings in our practice. That is because of not understanding the Dharma. We have faith, but not without using our intelligence. We have not really learned what Buddhism teaches, and therefore we have made a mistake. And so usually these days I say that we have to be 21st century Buddhists. What that means is you have to understand the whole picture of Buddhism, whole structure of Buddhism, and not just stay idle, contented with having faith. I tell Chinese Buddhist brothers and sisters, they say Om Tabo, Om Tabo, and then they make an offering in a yellow envelope, and they just stay contented doing that. So I tell them, and then we also recite Om Mani Padme Hum, the 6-syllable mantra of Avalokiteshvara, and then when you are able to, when you have to recite it rather quickly, when you go quicker and quicker, you come to say money, 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 and this sounds similar to the English word money for currency. And then you only think about when you are reciting the mantra, you would be almost praying for dollars. So in this 21st century, we have a teaching, a religion which is which attracts even those non-believers, skeptics. And if we do not learn about it and just remain ignorant about our own religion, it's not good. It would be a disgrace to ourselves. And so, therefore, we have to know what Buddhism is about. And this has to be, this will come through study. And therefore, wherever I go, I make it a point to explain Buddhism rather more than giving initiations or blessings and so forth. For example, when I give Kala Chakra initiation, many people gather for the Kala Chakra initiation, and therefore, because many people gather together, I make it a point to explain Buddhism. And when I give those explanations, people just sleep. And then during the actual, and therefore, what happens is so when I give the initiation, then people become alert. So therefore, I make it a point always to explain the teaching. And it's almost like deceiving people because they come for Kala Chakra, and I give all these very grand explanations of the teaching for them in order for them to understand the Dharma. Last year, when I was going to Jispa in Kelang, I stopped on the way in one village, and some of those people in the village were together with me when I climbed up the hill to the Gandapada sacred hill of sacred hill of Chakrasamvara. And so one of the ladies said she was also with me. And then I asked them, what is Buddhism? And they say it is reciting these lines of Buddham Sharanam Gacchami, Sangam Sharanam Gacchami, Sangam Sharanam Gatami. And then I asked, what is Buddha? Who is a Buddha? And she said, I don't know. And then I asked whether Buddha and the other teachers of such as Jesus Christ or Ishvara and so forth are same. They said yes, they are same. So this shows that they do not know who the Buddha is. So I told them that they must study Buddhism. And it's very important to learn what Buddhism is all about. And then also I was last year I was in nearby Lucknow, where they had some ceremony, and I asked the children in the school, what is the meaning of Buddham Sharanam Gacchami and Dhammam Sharanam Gacchami? And they said they didn't know. So what this shows is that we have taken our own religion for granted and just recited prayers and not try to understand the meaning of these prayers. So it's important to study. So even when it comes to practice, we can see in our own community that people who are rather well off have some in their house and some separate room for altar and for doing their prayers and so forth. And then even with regard to the inside the altar room, they will have great big statues, expensive statues are put higher, and the more less expensive, the cheaper ones put lower, and so forth. So, but then what they do is, when they were in the prayer room, they would be doing some puja. But once they are out of that room, then they would be fighting with others and quarreling with others and deceiving others. So when they live their life, then they rather are obsessed with all kinds of negative emotions, indulging all these negative emotions. So that's not the way to go about with Dharma practice. Whatever you practice in the prayer room must be practical and useful in your daily life. So what you have to be able to do if you say you are practicing the Dharma is to be able to control your negative emotions, knowing what are the benefits of restraining them and refraining from them, and what are the disadvantages of not doing so. So if you can think of the final goal, the ultimate goal of becoming a Buddha for the benefit of all sentient beings, then your practice of refraining from, for example, killing would be more powerful. Whereas if you just say, "Oh, if I kill somebody, I'll suffer. Maybe I'll go to jail," and so forth, that's not so powerful. So you have to think of attaining nirvana, enlightenment, when you think of refraining from certain negative actions and taking up positive ones, and not just thinking about having a better rebirth in the next life. So Buddhism is mainly about a practice or means which leads us to that state of nirvana, enlightenment. Even for someone who is a Christian, whether they do believe in a next life or not, a rebirth or not, if they do practice sincerely, they turn virtuous actions and avoiding the non-virtuous actions. Of course, those will create the cause for them to have a better life, a rebirth in the next life. And then, when from the point of view of Buddhism, when we talk about that of nirvana, liberation, if you can think that the liberation is, we are obstructed from reaching that state because of our grasping at some true existence of things and events. So when you understand that this the grasping at some true existence of things and events is the cause for us to which obstructs us from reaching that enlightenment or nirvana, then you would work to go against or overcome these negative potential and think of reaching enlightenment by overcoming this grasping at true existence. So the theistic religions, for theistic religions, the practices come from the God, whereas in Buddhism, someone starts from an ordinary person and then engages in the path and finally become a Buddha by making transformation within, leading oneself higher and higher through in spiritual steps. So you listen to a teaching from someone, a teacher, and then apply those teachings within oneself, and thereby make progress internally, make progress within oneself, and overcome all our shortcomings, and then become a Buddha. So since we start from the level of an ordinary sentient being, in order to reach that high ultimate goal, we have to understand the basis, the nature of things, and the basis and the ground level. And the Buddha himself has said, we know what suffering is, know that this is suffering. Of course, in Buddhism, there is this explanation of the cosmos with the Mount Meru in the center, and then there's 4 continents and subcontinents and so forth. But I don't believe in this cosmology that is presented in our classical texts. So which are, of course, which were written in those days, which refer to India more or less. So of course Vasubandhu was a great master. But then whatever he has said, I mean everything that he has said in his classical texts, such as Abhidhamma Kosha, cannot be taken literally. So even if you do not believe in the cosmology, presentation of the cosmology in Abhidhamma, rather literally, it doesn't matter. If we can even check what are the provisional teachings and what are the definitive teachings of the Buddha, and then why can't we do this with the teaching of Vasubandhu as well? Of course, when people do their practice of so of course people, if you don't really know the basic overall structure of Buddhism, if you just go on faith, base your practice on faith alone, then of course you may do the practice of making mandala offerings with visualizing all the Mount Meru in the center and the four continents in the four directions and so forth. But then if someone comes to you and says these are not really there, and gives you arguments against such things, I mean you may lose. You may lose your faith. So this should not happen. And then with regard to the distance of the sun and moon from the earth, also we cannot take those that are given in the Abhidhamma Kosha literally. So with regard to the external world, how it's described in our classical texts, of course we cannot take them literally, but then when it comes to the internal world, dealing with the internal world, I mean there we have all these detailed explanations of our emotions, how to tackle them, and the results of tackling them, and so forth. So the basic structure of Buddhism is really amazing. And we also have explanations of particles, subparticles, and so forth. So in order to engage in the practice, we have to understand the basic nature of things on the ground level, whether it's about impermanent nature of things or the things having no independent or self-existence and so forth. You have to understand the nature of reality. And once you understand that, then on the basis of that you develop the philosophical understandings. So we say in Buddhism, it is said that ignorance is the basic cause of our suffering. It doesn't say that suffering is created by God or anything like that, but because of our own actions that we have created, karma that we have created, we undergo the experiences of pain and pleasure. So nobody consciously creates suffering for themselves. Nobody would want to create suffering for themselves consciously. So because we don't want suffering but we want happiness, therefore we have those of the teachings on what to adopt and what to discard, and thereby engage in the practices of overcoming all suffering and its causes. And so at this level we have the Buddhist science when we deal with the basic reality of at the ground level. So where we also explain or describe the different emotions, the negative, destructive emotions, what are the nature of the destructive emotions and the nature of things, the realities. And on the basis of that, so in the Buddhist terminology, we use the term the reality of the nature of reality of the basis, at the basis level or the ground level. And then, and because on the basis of this understanding of what to adopt and what to reject, we have the practices. Therefore, we have the process of developing the path, spiritual path within ourselves, through which we can overcome the negative thoughts and emotions and develop the positive ones. And then also, because of this, we can also talk about following such and such path, you have such and such result, and following the others, you have such and other results. And therefore, we talk about the resultant state, experience of nirvana and so forth. Of course, we all recite the verse of the verse which says, "I take refuge in the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha until I reach enlightenment." And the practices of generosity and so forth that I engage in, may they become the cause for enlightenment for the benefit of all sentient beings. So in this verse we are saying we take the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha to be our refuge objects, to whom we take refuge in. And so when we talk about taking refuge, it is understood in terms of our goal of enlightenment or liberation. So Chandrakirti says that those the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha are the saviors or objects of refuge for those who wish liberation. Now, the means to reach that goal of enlightenment or liberation is to that of understanding selflessness. And the selflessness, understanding of selflessness is the antidote to grasping at some independent self or a person. So someone becomes a Buddha and a Sangha based on the Dharma, the Dharma jewel. So what is this Dharma jewel? So we need to have awareness in order to overcome some ignorance, in order to know, in order to overcome our ignorance about the alphabets. We have to learn what the alphabets. We cannot just pray to overcome this ignorance. And then we have to be introduced. So therefore we are introduced to the letters that are written, and so since there is no other way than developing wisdom and understanding in order to overcome ignorance, the ignorance, which is the source or the root of our the suffering, because this is the case, the ego grasping is the root of our suffering. So this ego grasping conceives and grasps at some the existing self or a person which is not there, and so it's distorted view, and therefore we need to overcome this distorted view through the understanding of selflessness. So if you study, if you learn how this distortion has happened, then you'll see that there's nothing else other than there being selflessness. So because self-grasping is a distorted view, there is a possibility to overcome it through the understanding of selflessness. So between the two, that of this ego grasping doesn't have any epistemic sort of support, whereas the understanding of selflessness has it. And therefore, although both of these are not in the intrinsic nature of the mind, but still the understanding of emptiness or understanding of selflessness can be developed further and further through. For that, we need to engage in listening to teachings on selflessness, and then having heard teachings, then we have to reflect on them and the meaning, and then gain some conviction, and on the basis of that conviction we develop a further insight into it through meditation. So by applying these antidotes, we overcome that of the reach that of overcoming the state whereby we have overcome all these negativities within ourselves. And so that of the Dharma jewel is this principle which leads us to, on the one hand, the principle which leads us to reach the nirvana, which comprises of the experience of having overcome the negativities, and also the path or the insight that leads to that realization. And finally, through the path and overcoming these negativities within ourselves gradually, we finally reach that of nirvana. So after studying the Dharma and reflecting and developing our experience of the Dharma, we realize the Dharma rather directly, and at that point we become a Sangha as well. And so, and then finally we become a Buddha. So through Dharma, based on the Dharma, we develop the true Dharma within ourselves, the Dharma jewel, and then we become a Sangha, and then we become enlightened. But in terms of for us to be able to practice the Dharma, we have to have the teacher, the Buddha, and therefore from that point of view we have the Buddha, and then the Dharma, and then through the practice of the Dharma we produce Sangha. And then in Buddhism we say that we have the potential to become a Buddha. So there is with regard to Buddha nature, according to some explanations, it said that we have a certain seed for becoming enlightened, and then according to Uttara Tantra by Maitreya, we have the Buddha nature is understood in terms of the the reality or the final nature of the mind, which within ourselves, which is still defiled. So this defiled nature or Buddha nature is purified through the understanding of the nature, the final nature of the mind itself. So eventually, we become a Buddha. So what we are saying by reciting this verse is, I take refuge until I become enlightened. So until all the defilements within myself are completely gone from within my mind stream, I will take refuge in the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. And according to Maitreya's text, we have this potential for Buddhahood, which is the Buddha nature, and because of this very Buddha nature, we are receptive to the blessings of the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. And so, when you are totally, completely free from all the defilements, all the defilements, then you become a Buddha, whereby you reach a state where you have fulfilled your own goal completely and also are able to fulfill the interests of all sentient beings. And therefore, because of this, we say, when we think of Buddhahood, we are thinking of reaching that, or wishing to reach that goal for the benefit of other sentient beings. And therefore, the next two lines in the verse is of refuge, and Bodhichitta says, all the practices of generosity and so forth that I do, may they become cause for me to become a Buddha, to benefit all sentient beings. So it seems my general introductory talk has been rather long. So in other words, you have to understand, when you recite the verse, the meaning of the verse in terms of refuge and taking refuge and bodhicitta. So the text we are going to go through are Nagarjuna's hymn to the Buddha, the world transcendent, in which he praises the Buddha for having understood the nature of the interdependent nature of things precisely as it is. And similarly, the Master Tsongkhapa praises the Buddha in his text, which is the second text, which is in praise of to the Buddha for teaching dependent origination. And therefore, because of this reason, that the Buddha text praising the Buddha for teaching this the nature of dependent origination. So with regard to the first text, I only have oral reading transmission of the text, the Nagarjuna's text. I have received this transmission from the Rezong Rinpoche, who is the current Gaden Rinpoche. And then the second text, which is by Tsongkhapa, I received it, the oral transmission from Kinori Master Ringzin Tempa. So the title of the text reads, Sanskrit title is Lokatita Stova, in Tibetan Jigdinle Depa. So Jigdinle Depa means the world transcendent, So here the distinction can be made on the basis of whether someone has reached the path of the Aryas, someone who sees that of selflessness or emptiness directly or not. So those who are below that level are known as below the level of underseeing selflessness directly are termed as worldly beings. The first verse. So the first verse is similar to Nagarjuna's other verse, which says, "I pay homage to the Buddha, who out of his compassion has taught dependent origination in order for us to overcome our distorted views." So the first two lines are praising the Buddha by taking into account his understanding of the nature of things, which is the empty nature of things. And the second two lines are based on that of the compassion, of altruism. Second verse, that apart from the mere aggregates, shows that there is no sentient being apart from the psychophysical aggregates, as taught earlier. Therefore, the sentient beings who are suffering do not exist apart from these psychophysical aggregates you uphold. And so you see sentient beings as like illusion, that there's no independently existing things. So what this is saying is that how we perceive things, the things do not exist in the way we perceive them. So from the point of view of ultimate reality or emptiness, even the Buddha does not exist, and the sentient beings also do not exist. So if that is the case, how can we think of liberating sentient beings? But if you give real thought to this, you'll understand that although things do not exist in the ultimate sense, they do not have any independent existence. Yet, although things are selfless, sentient beings are selfless, so it says, yet, great sage, you continue to remain perfectly immersed in the welfare of beings. So because the law of causality still functions even though things do not have any intrinsic or independent existence, therefore there is a basis for working for the benefit of others. So some of them, the students who earlier participated in the debates, they have not got the text, so he's just joking. Maybe it's because they already know the Dharma. Verse number 4. So the reason here is that of dependent origination. So in many of the sutras, the Buddha says that things do not have any independent existence because they are dependent on other factors. So this, with regard to dependence, there is the causal dependence on the one level. Dependence in terms of causality, which means that causes giving rise to their effects. And then we also talk about designation through dependence. So with regard to the dependence, there is the causality, the dependence in terms of causality and dependence in terms of designation. So when we talk about designation through dependence in terms of designation, giving label to others, it doesn't matter whether things are caused by causes and brought about by causes and conditions or others. So there is a very subtle level of dependence here, whereas slightly easier way to level of understanding this dependence is that of dependence of things based or in relation to their parts. So we can talk about a whole and its parts. So the whole is dependent on the parts. So a whole is designated on the basis of its parts. And then when it comes to the finest understanding, the subtlest or the finest understanding of dependence, according to the tradition of Nagarjuna, the dependence here is understood in terms of mere designation. So we can talk about a whole and its parts. So the whole and the parts both do not exist in their own rights. Although both of these appear to us as if they have some independent existence, some kind of essence there, if we check carefully, we will not be able to find anything to point to our finger at as being the whole or the parts. So although there is this kind of appearance to us, if things were to have such an existence, an essential existence from its own side, their own sides, then we should be able to find them under analysis when we search for them. But we cannot find that. Therefore, we have to leave the things on the conventional level. And therefore, Nagarjuna's tradition says that things are merely designated through dependence. Nothing exists. There is no self-existence at all. There is no existence from its own side. There is no true existence. So therefore, we have the three levels of understanding dependence. On the one level, there's the law of causality. So if you posit a self, a soul theory, then although you may say things, there is the law of causality that causes give rise to their effects and so forth, but then the person who relates with those things does exist rather independently, and therefore you cannot have a complete understanding of the interdependent nature of things. So, of course, in their own traditions, the theistic religions do not talk about the such things, that things are dependently arisen and so forth. But from the point of view of Buddhists, we can say that they may be able to say that things come about through causes and conditions, and therefore perhaps they can posit this law of causality or dependence in terms of law of causality. And then this teaching of interdependent nature of things is something unique to Buddhism. Of course, love, compassion, patience, and so forth are taught in all the different religious traditions. So no other religious tradition teaches this interdependent nature of things. So Buddhism teaches that good and bad and so forth are posited in relation to one another, in relation to others. So when we say, what this indicates is that usually when we are angry at somebody, we say, this person has caused me suffering, and as if there is some kind of an absolute person there to point your finger at. But when you understand that, when you have an idea of dependent nature of things, and that person who harms you has done so in dependence on many different factors, and within that different factors, the multiple factors, I'm also included. And so you cannot have, if you understand that, you cannot have an independent target of your anger. And similarly with attachment, you say, but this is beautiful, and you are attracted to that. You have an absolute object which you are attached to. Mere desire is not so bad, because we can have a desire for happiness, we can have desire for the freedom from suffering. So Whereas the term attachment, when we use it, though I do not know exactly what it connotes in English, but there is the clinging part aspect to it. So desire can be something objectively, which can happen objectively, with an objective view, unbiased, whereas the attachment cannot have that unbiased way of looking at the thing. So about 10 years ago, I met a scientist. So he was a scientist. When I met him, he said that when we are angry at somebody, we see the person totally negative, as being negative. But then that negativity is 90% of it. Apart the 90% of that is just projection, our own projection. Maybe 10% of it may be true. So in Buddhism also we say the similar thing. So we say that there is this kind of projection of the good and bad onto the things, and then accordingly we become attached or become angry at them. As Nagarjuna says, our karma and delusions come from distorted views, and so that kind of mental wrong projections. And so, with regards to dependent arising or dependent nature of things, we have these three levels. One is the causality, the other is like relative nature of things, positing things in relation to others, and then the third one is that of the mere designation of things. So this is very, very powerful. Even if you can take the understanding of dependence in politics, economics, global level. In reality, what is there is that there is the appearance that everything is independent, but then the reality is
of that is more investigation about the reality. Because there is destructive emotion based on the appearance, and there is always big gap, appearance and reality. So the reality knows only through investigation. That they under
So this is something great that is taught in Buddhism. It's unique also. So if the results were to have any independent existence, then it cannot rely on causes. But because it doesn't exist independently, it is dependent on causes. So it's a matter of whether you give thought to this or not. So because the causes, the results are dependent on its causes, therefore it cannot have any independent existence. And if there is no result as such, we cannot talk about cause as well. Of in terms of temporal sequence, the cause comes first, but then the result, we can also talk about the result being dependent on the cause being dependent on the result as well. Because the mere fact that we say something is a cause is because of its result. And therefore, the cause is dependent on the result, just as the result is also dependent on the cause. So why would you not uphold that clearly they are just like reflections? The four great elements are not perceptible to the eye, so how can entities be perceptible to the eye? And so Nagarjuna also says in his jewel garland that the great elements and then the resultant things or that come from them are dependent. And he says, how can there be form and so forth without the great element? So it seems Nagarjuna is saying that there is no separate element which we can when it comes to the finest, the subtlest level of these elements, it seems we cannot have any separate entities which we can point to as being the water element, air element, the fire element, wind element, and so forth. But then all of them are together. On the other hand, if we take those of the sensory organs, without the visual objects, maybe we cannot talk about the visual organs as such. And then we can even talk about the flower itself. Take a flower and say, apart from the color and the shape and so forth, what is there to be point our finger to as being flower? And also similarly, when you see me, of course you see me, my face, my front part. And when I look at you also, I see the front part of your body. But then apart from the color and the shape and so forth, what body is there? So you can say, I hear His Holiness' body, I can hear His voice. And so through these two, you may think, so of course you can say this is my voice, this is my body and so forth. But then who is this Tenzin Gyatso? To whom this body and the voice belongs to? So if you ask by somebody, where did you go? What did you hear? You may say, I saw His Holiness, I heard His Holiness teaching. But then if you asked, who is His Holiness? You would rather be dumbfounded, perhaps. So everything can be analyzed in this way. So the verse number 5 refers to form or matter, and then the next one is about feeling or sensation. So when we use some name, or such as a name vase, then we should have some objects as its reference. So the name vase is applied to an object which has a certain feature, like a bulbous body and a flat bottom, and the function of holding water and so forth. But then if you were to go, search for that very object in the vase, you cannot really come to anything that you can point to as being that vase. But then we use the term vase to refer to that object, and accordingly it functions in the world. Since without the felt there is no feeling, feeling itself is devoid of self, so you uphold that what is felt too is devoid of intrinsic existence. And then the verse number 7, if a word and its referent are not different, the word fire would burn one's mouth. If they are different, there will be no comprehension. This you, the speaker of truth, have stated. And so here we can talk about the action, the actor, the agent, and the object acted upon. So the action is dependent on the actor, the agent, and similarly, and vice versa. So there cannot be an action without an actor. Without an actor, there cannot be an action. So apart from this kind of dependence, you cannot point to anything as being the action or the actor and agent and so forth. So do you understand something? Do you get? So we'll have a question and answer session now. So today the organizers have already collected some questions, written questions. So Geshe Losam Dawa is going to read the questions, but His Holiness says tomorrow the individuals themselves should ask. So Buddha has talked about wrong living. What practical use is Buddhism, studying Buddhism in our day-to-day life. So first of all, you have to study Buddhism. Even scientists find it really practical. And so after having studied, and when you give thoughts to teaching, such as when it comes to practice, practicing patience, then you will find some practical value in it, and the teachings may become part of your daily life. What should one do to overcome laziness? So of course it doesn't matter if you are lazy to do something which is not worthwhile. Once there's a story where somebody came and one person was rather rubbing a rock. The first person asked what he was doing, and he said, "I'm going to turn this rock into a powder and just leave it here." So that doesn't really make much sense. So what Buddhism is teaching is how to transform oneself, how to become disciplined. And so if there's a way to do that, of course it's worthwhile, tempting. So understanding with regards to practice of morality, for example, there is a morality which is called gathering of the virtue. And so if you see that the purpose of doing this kind of practice of morality is to overcome our immoral actions, immorality, and reach that of the nirvana, then you'll see the purpose. So you have to see the purpose in order to engage in certain actions. So in classical Buddhist texts, there is the in quantum physics, his own sense is that in quantum when it comes to quantum physics, there's nothing objectively existing. What is the difference between peace of mind and the peace, as is said when we say nirvana is peace? So of course, peace of mind can be of any degree. We can have it ordinarily, but the highest level of peace of mind is what is referred by nirvana is peace. So all the different religious traditions talk about or teaches us to develop peace of mind. So even the birds can have peace of mind to a certain extent when they do not have any kind of a threat from other predators. But when the predators come, then they all become restless. How do somebody develop bodhicitta within oneself in a day-to-day life, and what are the means to developing that? So with regard to developing bodhicitta, there are two different ways. One which is followed by practitioners with high sharp faculty, and one followed by the practitioners with lesser faculty, intelligence. So if you follow the path of the first type of beings, then you need to have some skepticism in the beginning, and without that you will not question about things. And therefore, when we talk about skepticism or doubt, there is skepticism or doubt which is positive, and of course skepticism, there is also negatives. So if you can use your intelligence and understand that there's a possibility of enlightenment and that it is possible for one to attain that, and with such understanding you have to have this determination or the wish to reach enlightenment. So without knowing, there's just you will just staying blind to these, you will not be able to develop bodhicitta. So of course you have to understand that the possibility of developing the mind, just reciting some lines of bodhicitta, saying, for the sake of all sentient beings, may I become a Buddha, so forth, will not, it does not mean that you develop bodhicitta as such. So you have to develop it based on your understanding and awareness. It is the Tibetans are very fortunate to have His Holiness the Tibetans are very fortunate to have His Holiness with us, and so the question was basically the Tibetans inside Tibet very much eager to have His Holiness back in Tibet, and so can His Holiness visit Tibet? His Holiness said no one can tell that. Of course, all Tibetans inside Tibet have kept the Tibetan spirit rather very strongly. Although we have a new generation of Tibetans, but the spirit of Tibet has not diminished. So of course the Chinese have a hand in it, because they have been trying to destroy the Tibetan identity and destroying Tibetan religion and so forth, and they have been very biased in their. So if the Chinese have continued what they have done initially when they came to Tibet, giving money and silver coins to Tibetans and pleasing them and leaving them in peace, if they had continued this throughout, then of course Tibetans may not have kept this Tibetan spirit rather strongly as they are now. So when it comes to crushing Tibetan demonstrations inside Tibet and so forth, they say everyone has to be crushed. So perhaps there's no other country which says that those who do some mischievous things that are against the country and government policy and so forth, they should be crushed completely. So even animals will not like if you try to beat them up. So we are living in a free country, but it seems that Tibetans inside Tibet have a stronger will to keep our identity and to keep our language. So perhaps we are rather slightly spoiled being in a free country, it seems. So Holiness usually says that all religions have the same practice of compassion, love, and all that. But then the question is, says the certain religious traditions have the practice of animal sacrifice. So please give an answer to this. So most of the religions believe in a certain kind of a soul or earth material. And whereas perhaps they say the human beings have a soul, animals do not have any souls. So perhaps this is the reason. So when we travel in the past, when I traveled from Dharamsala to Pathankot, on the way I see birds, chickens in cages and so forth for food. And also in Bangalore, I saw on the roadside such things. So these animals are only looked at as being food for us, and people do not have this idea that this is also a sentient being with a feeling. So of course it depends on the different religions, traditions themselves. So some have the sacrifice, practice of animal sacrifice. In the past in Tibet also we used to have such practice before Buddhism came. So this happened because of certain views, certain ideology that they follow. So of course we cannot say this these certain things are wrong just because it's wrong from the point of view of Buddhism. We cannot say that in Buddhism, we cannot go to somebody who follows some other tradition and say that in Buddhism we are against killing animals and so forth, so therefore you should not do it. You cannot do that with others. You cannot say that they are wrong because they have their own tradition, so we cannot say that. So once I heard a story from some Lama that Ladakhis in the past used to go to some place and kill black sheep and then make offerings, and he stopped the people from doing that. So what does this hand gesture of mandala offering signify or symbolize? So the center, two fingers in the center that are standing represent or symbolize that of the Mount Meru, of course, which is non-existent. And then the four the others represent those of the four continents. So perhaps you do not need to do that. So if there is no Mount Meru and so forth, which these gestures symbolize, But then, when you make mandala offerings, you have the visualization or the thing. You have to imagine that you are making offering to the Buddhas and so forth, in order that you may be able to serve sentient beings with your body, speech, and mind. So, even in the prayers, we say, "I offer my body, the virtues collected throughout the 3 times, with my body, speech, and mind, and all the resources that I have, and all the different precious materials and so forth." So that so the person who ever asked this question, do you actually understand? His Holiness asks, do you understand what emptiness means? It doesn't mean that you can take something out of your pocket and say it's empty. That emptiness is something that you can take out of your pocket or something like that. But because things are things are dependently arisen, therefore they are empty of any independent existence. There is no self-existence as such. And because things do not have self-existence, therefore it's feasible, it's tenable to say that they are dependent. Buddha Palita says in his commentary to the Nagarjuna's fundamental wisdom that if things were to have some intrinsic existence of their own, in their own right, then we can just take one thing and just be able to point to that as being this and that. But that's not the case. It's dependent. Therefore, there's nothing which is independently existing. And therefore, as I said earlier, we have to understand the reality on the ground level, and then also the path. So all of them are dependently originated things. Of course, the basis, ground, path, and the ground result are all dependently arisen things. And because they're dependent, because they do not have any independent existence, that is, the dependence of things is feasible. So when we say things are empty, it doesn't mean any nihilism, but then that there is something. So even within the Madhyamaka philosophical school philosophers, there are those who say that things cannot be merely dependent in name. So you have to understand and be able to differentiate between what is meant by lack of independent existence and nihilism. So we can talk about things, you can take one thing and say that something is devoid of independent existence. The natural disasters and the nuclear weapons that we have today may destroy the whole world. And so at that time, the self will not be there at all. Of course, it would be best if we can make this self or person non-existent. So in the world, but we say that the Big Bang is also beginningless. The galaxies are also, there are limitless, infinite galaxies. So there's no beginning. So once there was somebody who said that these days we have lots of people who use contraceptions and stop giving birth to people. So perhaps we'll have problem with humanity, the race of human race in the future. So of course this world has the different stages. There's the stage of evolution, then stage of when the world remains for a while, and then finally get destroyed, and there's the empty state. So it's the world comes and goes. So for example, when we die from this life, we go into the subtlest level of mind, and then again we take rebirth, and then again we'll have the gross states of mind within ourselves, and again the same process of dissolution will take place, and some process of evolution from the subtle mind to the gross mind take place. And so this is the case with the internal world of sentient beings, but then also the similar kind of process also happens in the external world of the external worlds, which are made of the 5 different elements. So the gross elements and the material things come from the subtle elements. And so when we die, the gross states of mind will dissolve into the subtle levels, and then finally we'll have what is known as the clear light or luminous state of mind. So just as this kind of process of dissolution takes place in a sentient being, it also happens. We have also within the sentient being also we have the 6 different elements. So just as in the external world there is a dissolution of the 5 different elements, in the internal world of sentient beings we also have the dissolution of these elements. Earth, water, fire, wind, and then also the space element, and then there of the subtle mind, the clear light. And so this is also mentioned in the Maitreya's Uttara Tantra, and similarly in the highest yoga tantra, this process of dissolution when somebody dies is described, and so from the gross level to the subtlest level of mind and wind energy, things dissolve, and then from there again come back. also in science it's said that water is made up of gas. So in Buddhism also we talk about the subtle level of elements. In science also they talk about a quark when you go to the subatomic level. So perhaps they are talking about some kind of a mental object, because this cannot be seen by naked eye. Of course, atom can be seen, but the subatomic particles, like quark, is not perceptible to our naked eyes. So we can still compare between scientific presentation and explanation of these particles and what is explained in Buddhism. Someone who doesn't know any religion, so someone who wishes to have peace of mind, disciplined mind, is it necessary for that person to follow some religious tradition? He always no. So of course it's not necessary. If someone doesn't believe, doesn't have that, can't believe in religion, if they try to follow some religious tradition, perhaps it can turn them crazy. So you have to be very sincere, serious about whatever religious tradition you are following. It's not enough just to say you are a Buddhist or a Christian. For example, Christians go to churches on Sundays and do prayers, and then that's all. In a day-to-day life, people just engage in all kinds of emotional, like they indulge in attachment, anger, and so forth. So most of the people are not very serious, even though they say they are following certain religious tradition. They are not very serious about it. Whereas if you are really serious, you can see a difference in them. Like a custom. And the worst case scenario is that you develop attachment to your religion, and then you have all kinds of mischievous things, problems created in the name of religion. So of course they use the name religion, but then it's the main focus is the power and money. So because of this, so people just misuse religion. They use the name religion for power and money.
Emotion. So then much easier to manipulate. Like that. So today, this is and never church, so the symbol. Yana, driver. So if you are rather happy with following certain religious tradition, then it will be good. Nobody will come to plead to you to follow some religious tradition. One Westerner came to Song Rinpoche
Buddhism is very complicated, and Song Rinpoche scolded him. Who asked you to follow Buddhism? Who forced you to do it? So if you think in terms of philosophy, Buddhism is really academic subject. So even if you may not have, even if you don't have faith in Buddhism, if you study Buddhism, it will help you to have a broad outlook on things in the world. So therefore, I usually make a distinction divide Buddhism into these three categories: Buddhist science, Buddhist philosophy, or and then Buddhist religion or Buddhism.
Western modern science.
So even modern science, modern world needs Buddhist science with regard to mind, explanations of mind, psychology. So far, what they have focused on is something that they can measure. So Buddhist philosophy really is helpful for investigating, analyzing things. So if the Buddhist science and Buddhist philosophy remain in the scriptures alone, then it would be really sad. It would be a waste as well. And therefore, I have asked scholars to compile a book on Buddhist philosophy, and to compile a book on Buddhist science. So of course we can leave out the aspects of those philosophies which are unique to Buddhism, which have to do with Buddhist religion as such. But the others we can understand if we use our common sense. So once we have the books ready in our language, we'll have the translations into English and then maybe other languages. So these can be used as academic subjects. So this can be very helpful to use in universities and so forth. They're really universal. So perhaps when we have these books ready, this can be used as textbooks in the schools.